Hello, everybody, and welcome to We Measure the World, a podcast produced by scientists for scientists.
And the other part of our project is looking at soil health and Kernza's ability to maintain and improve soil health when you're transitioning from wheat into Kernza. We think that planting Kernza in what was previously a wheat field should change the soil microbiome to be more similar to what you might expect to see in a CRP field, so that conservation reserve program land that's specifically designed just to mimic the behavior of the native prairie without any effort to extract resources from it, basically. We're hoping to see, and we have seen, that planting Kernza does move the soil microbiome to be much more similar to that of CRP land, which is a strong indicator of improving soil health and the ability of the soil to sequester more carbon into the future.
That's just a small taste of what we have in store for you today. We Measure the World explores interesting environmental research trends, how scientists are solving research issues, and what tools are helping them better understand measurements across the entire soil-plant atmosphere continuum. Today's guest is Alex Fox. Alex received his bachelor's in Mathematics and Astrophysics from Oberlin College. He is currently a Hydrologic Science PhD candidate at the University of Wyoming Plant Physiological Ecology Laboratory. Alex's research focuses on modeling and measuring the relationship between ecosystem scale processes and plant physiology, especially as they relate to land management and disturbance. And today he's here to talk about his research into Kernza, a perennial grain that could revitalize agriculture in drier climates through building soil health, fighting climate change, and supporting local farmers. So Alex, thanks so much for being here.
That's great to be here.
All right, let's jump in first. We'd love to get a little more info into your background. So we'd like to know if you'd like to tell us a little bit about how you got into the sciences and what led you from mathematics and astrophysics on into studying agriculture and plant physiology and ecology.
Yeah, well, I've always been interested in the natural world and sort of understanding how you can break down really complicated processes into simpler components that you can analyze and understand to help you solve problems. And that definitely is what led me to study physics and math at my undergrad. I was really drawn to how you can express so much complexity using the language of mathematics, I think. And that was really appealing to me intellectually, I think. But as I slowly went through my undergrad, I realized that I wanted to study something that was a little bit more, I guess, down to earth, so to speak. So I started to get interested in hydrology, and initially I was drawn in by water policy in the Western United States. I remember I read the book Cadillac Desert by, I think, Mark Reisner. It was a phenomenal book, and it really kind of changed my perspective on just how important it is to focus on issues of natural resources and doing what we can to get what we can out of the land without really destroying it. He talks a lot in that book about how our need to acquire more water and more resources has really sort of put us in a bad predicament in the current age. And that sort of led me down a road to studying agriculture and sustainable agriculture, and trying to take my physics and math background and apply it where I could to natural ecosystems. Eventually, it took me to the University of Wyoming, where I worked as a field tech running eddy covariance instrumentation that University of Wyoming has in the Snowy Range east of Laramie, where they were looking at how bark beetles and forest fire interact to affect things like carbon cycling, water cycling, and energy budgets in the subalpine forests. And that's part of my research. But another part of my research is what we're talking about today, which is having to do with Kernza. So before I was here at the University of Wyoming, I did an internship at the Land Institute, which is the research nonprofit who initially developed this grain crop called Kernza, with the idea of using it to sort of help reconcile the human economy with nature's economy of carbon, water, and nutrient cycling. So here at the University of Wyoming, we're working on this project, which completed in April of this year, but we're still doing a lot of the analysis on what we found to try to introduce this novel perennial grain crop to Wyoming agroecosystems.
So yeah, let's talk a little bit about this Wyoming Kernza project. How did this all get started? But just kind of an overview. Could you give us a quick glimpse into the Wyoming Kernza project, how it came about, what the main goals are for it?
This project is sort of inspired by the fact that dryland grain agriculture in Wyoming is very hard. So much of the grain that's grown in eastern Wyoming, so like east of the Laramie Range near the Nebraska border, is grown in this wheat fallow rotation where you'll have wheat in the ground for about 8 months, and then you'll let the fields go fallow for the next 14 months. Like no cover crops. We've looked at cover crops, using cover crops in this area, and they don't work. They use up too many resources. They don't produce enough yields to be able to make money. They're very water hungry. They're very thirsty. So they use this 1 year wheat, 1 year fallow rotation. I mean, it has a lot of problems. It's really inefficient at using water, right? Because any water that falls on the fallow fields, most of it will run off or evaporate by the time you actually get your wheat in the ground the next year. It's really bad for soil erosion. It generally requires very heavy tillage. And also, since you don't have a cover crop, you're just sort of letting your soil, your topsoil and nutrients run off and blow away into Nebraska. And on top of that, we also have, since we're reliant on rainfall for all of our water inputs, and Wyoming only gets between 400 and 450 millimeters of precipitation a year in that part of the state anyway, which is less than half of what you might get in like Minnesota, or about half of what you might expect in central Kansas. You end up with really unreliable yields. So maybe 1 every 3 years, you might get a yield that you can sell or make a good amount of money on. So what farmers really need here is a crop that is cheap to plant and cheap to maintain, because annual wheat, all the tillage and fertilizer inputs and pesticide inputs are very expensive to farmers here. But also it can serve as a multi-use crop that can still provide utility and income when yields are poor and the weather is not conducive to producing grain yield. And on top of that, we want to be able to have a crop that can stabilize the soil structure and improve soil health. Kernza is kind of a perfect candidate for that. A lot of farms in this part of the country are part of the USDA Conservation Reserve Program, CRP, where the goal with that program is to try to maintain and stabilize the soil health and soil structure, and reduce erosion and conserve our sort of soil resources, and sort of try to mimic the ecological functions of the natural prairie. They use a lot of plants that you wouldn't expect in the natural prairie in this part of the country, like wheatgrass and alfalfa, for example. And that's very good at doing things like improving soil health and stabilizing soil structure and improving biodiversity. But it doesn't really provide any utility to farmers. And the thing with Kernza is that it is a crop that can be harvested for grain, for human consumption, or for forage for cattle. So it's a great multi-use crop that also is if you farm it right, is designed to fulfill some of those other goals of stabilizing soil structure, building soil health, building up soil in general, sequestering carbon. And there's a lot of ways that you can grow it that promote biodiversity as well, with intercropping with various other perennial species.
I'd love to get kind of back up a little bit and talk about, if you could, the history of Kernza. Like, where did this come from? How was it developed? And how did it become a promising candidate for studies like this?
So Kernza is actually just intermediate wheatgrass. So Thinopyrum intermedium is the species. It's a grass that's really commonly grown here in the West as part of CRP. It's just a perennial wheatgrass. It's not native to the US, but it provides a lot of ecological benefits being a perennial grass. And it has just been selectively bred over several decades to produce a grain yield that you can harvest and you can sell and you can use to make beer and whiskey and bread and cereals. Our local Walmart, actually, in Laramie, just started stocking Kernza flour, which is pretty exciting for us to see. So the history of it is that it's really the first brand new grain crop we've had in thousands of years, right? It's a brand new species. that has been selectively bred like we did with the annual wheat that we currently have to farm. Kernza is a trademark for the grain harvested from this cultivar of intermediate wheatgrass. It's a trademark that is owned by the Land Institute, which is a research nonprofit based in Salina, Kansas, where their overall mission is, like I said earlier, so this idea of improving the health of the general ecosphere, I guess, in a way that we can extract things like food and other resources from the natural world without destroying it, right? While maintaining its health and its benefits in the long term, such as carbon sequestration, the ability to produce food for us for hundreds to thousands of years. Started to focus on is this idea of natural systems agriculture, right? I think that's a pretty common term that's used now. Yeah, so they've had this breeding program to produce grain from intermediate wheatgrass for several decades. And Kernza is definitely the best known of what they've bred. It gets the most press, I think. They actually do research in many other different types of crops. So they have sort of a sister organization in China that has had a lot of success in breeding perennial rice for the same purpose. And a program that, from what I understand, has done much better than any of the programs with Kernza. Perennial rice is actually, from what I understand, a very successful breeding effort. There's several other programs, for example, breeding silphium as a perennial oilseed, and then other crops like that I know less about, such as sorghum, perennial sorghum, and sainfoin is another crop they're focusing on. Yeah, so instead of a grain, legumes, other sorts of food crops that we can try to make perennial in a way where we can get food and resources out of the landscape without degrading soil health and fertility in the long term.
So what are some of the key distinctive traits that have been selected for in the process of developing what is now Kernza?
So when you think of producing grain, the first thing you probably think of is just the volume of seeds, right? If you look at wild grass and then you look at a head of wheat will it's huge, it's heavy, it's full of giant seeds, whereas a head of wild type intermediate wheatgrass, it might have the same number of seeds, but they'll be very small. So that's sort of the first thing that comes to mind. Other important factors to consider have to do with the supply chain and with how you actually process the grain. So you want all the heads of your grain crop to mature at the same exact time, right? You don't want some of them to be mature and some of them haven't quite reached maturity yet, and some of them are too old and too dry. They just fall off when you run your combine over it. So you want to be able to collect everything all at once. You want to be able to dehull the grain really easily when you put it through a dehuller or a mill. So you want a really high free threshing fraction of your grain, right? You want to be able to put it through the thresher and basically have all of your grain come out of the husk. Wheat is really good at that. Intermediate wheatgrass is not so good at that. So that's something that they have to breed for. There's several other traits. I know that there's one that has to do with head shattering, which is something that I don't fully understand what that means. I think it has something to do with how easily the grains fall off of the head. And there's some other important considerations to make, right? Like if you're breeding for really high grain yield and you want this plant to stick all of its carbohydrates into its grain, maybe you have to worry about whether or not you're breeding that plant to take those nutrients out of, for example, its root system, right? Like maybe when it's putting all this energy into growing larger and fatter seeds for us to eat, maybe it's not putting so much energy into growing healthy, extensive root systems. Maybe it's not putting so much energy into feeding the microbiome in the soil that it needs to acquire more nutrients and to maintain soil health and stuff like that. And that's much harder to focus on. Some of the research that's come out of this project is focused on that. But yeah, those are some of the important considerations to make when breeding a crop and that have been made in breeding Kernza.
I definitely want to dig in to the research project itself with the methodology and your findings and other things. But just kind of in general, what has been known of the benefits of Kernza in terms of soil health, water usage, the cost effectiveness for farmers that might be growing it? What have people been seeing already when it comes to those kinds of benefits?
So I'm going to speak more about Wyoming and less about the rest of the country. There's a whole host of research on the benefits that Kernza has for those things in the rest of the country. But in Wyoming, the economic and climatic landscape is very different. It's very, like I said before, it's very hard to grow dryland wheat here and make any sort of profit at all. So speaking to the last thing that you asked about in terms of sort of the economics of growing Kernza here, we've found that Kernza actually is really promising in this part of the country in that it has very low input costs. So when you plant Kernza, you might till the soil, you will plant it, and then you might spray it, and then that's it for the next several years. If you want to harvest it, you just have to go harvest it, right? You don't have to replant it. You don't have to buy more seed. You don't have to till it up and plant it again, right? You don't have to spend all that money on fuel and more tractors and more labor hours. So it's very cost effective in that way. Kernza, while it does have a very low yield, so we found that the grain yield is about 1/6 of wheat when we grow it here. Kernza does fetch more at the market. It is a more expensive grain. So it kind of makes up for it in that way. And then also it really makes up for it in the fact that it's very cheap to make. So it's sort of an expensive grain that gets a high price at market, and then it also requires very low inputs. And that's a huge benefit here. And also in years where you don't get a good grain yield that you can sell, it makes a very good forage crop. It's very high in protein. The farmers that we worked with about 5 farmers on this project. One of them sold their grain to a distillery in Colorado, I believe. And then another one has been using it as forage for his cattle. So it's a great multi-use crop for people here. I think you'll have to repeat the first half of your question.
Part of that was looking at, or at least what are the known benefits so far in terms of like soil health and water usage?
Okay, yeah. So in terms of soil health, Kernza or intermediate wheatgrass, it's a perennial, right? So the roots stay in the soil all year round. And that really helps stabilize the soil, right? It's not going to blow away and run off as easily. It's going to help to tighten nutrient cycling. So in Wyoming, this isn't such a huge problem because it's very dry. But I know that in Kansas and farther east, Kernza is great for tightening nutrient cycling, keeping nitrogen in your system and other nutrients in your system because again, the root network is so extensive. It's great at feeding the microbiome because it produces so much below ground biomass. So you can sort of help to build soil health. And then also one of our hypotheses here in terms of water usage is that Kernza's perenniality and its rooting structure could really help it to acquire and hold on to water in ways that annual wheat crops cannot here. So you have deeper roots that might be able to access more soil moisture. You have denser roots and just higher live root biomass that can just access more soil moisture in the layers, in like the surface layers and a little bit below that. It's in the ground every single year, so any water that might run off or evaporate in a fallow field when you're growing wheat won't do that, and the Kernza can use that to grow biomass. So, physiologically, from what I understand, Kernza is actually less efficient at turning transpired water into biomass. So it has a slightly lower water use efficiency than wheat, but the other aspects of its physiology and management, such as its perenniality and its rooting structure, means that it seems to be able to regulate its need for water and how much water it can actually access better than wheat can. Seems to get less water stressed, and we think that it should just be able to get more water that wheat can't.
With Kernza being a perennial, what is the growth and harvest cycle like? What does that time span look like? Like you mentioned, some of the benefits compared to annual wheat.
So there's a couple different ways to grow it. You can plant Kernza in the fall or in the spring. If you plant Kernza in the fall, it has a chance to overwinter and you can get a grain yield the next year, but it might not be as competitive with weeds. You can also plant Kernza in the spring. If you plant Kernza in the spring, it can be slightly more competitive. It's easier for it to establish, but you won't get a yield that summer. You have to wait until the next year to get a yield. In Wyoming, what we've been doing is planting it in the spring because we're a little bit worried about weed pressure here. And it's so dry that we just want to make sure that it's able to grow first of all before we're worried about whether or not it'll give us a yield. So planting in the spring, it grows over the summer, it establishes itself, and the next summer is when we get our first green yield. It's a perennial crop. It's a little bit more hardy than annual wheat, so it requires slightly less management. There's at least one pesticide that's approved for use on it. That's 2,4-D. A couple of the farmers here have used that spray, but from what I understand, it is a more hardy crop once it's established and is less susceptible to weed pressure. It's a little bit more competitive.
And so then as a perennial crop, they're just letting it grow, go to seed, harvest, and that cycle continues basically infinitely.
As long as you want, yeah. I think that there is an issue with declining yields over the years. So in stands that have been growing for 5 or 6 years, they'll see lower yields than in stands that have been growing for 2 or 3 years. But yeah, that's the general cycle. It's you plant it, you let it grow, you harvest it that year or the next year if you get a grain yield. In Wyoming, we're not expecting a grain yield every single year. Only some of the years, and the other years you can harvest it for hay and forage. And then eventually grain yields will start to decrease and it'll probably have to be replanted. Farmers can harvest the seeds for themselves and replant it if they want. That's totally okay for farmers to do. One of the farmers we're working with, he actually retired at the end of the project. So his farm has been operating for 100 years continuously. And so what he's done is he's just planted Kernza and he's just letting it grow. He's not harvesting it anymore. He's folding it into his CRP program is what he has been able to do with it. So there's a lot of different things you can do. If you're somewhere where you're irrigating it or you're somewhere where it's a lot wetter, you can definitely get a grain yield every single year. Here, it's more about whatever the climate allows you to do this year, be it harvest when you can or cut it for hay and sell to cattle farmers and ranchers.
When it comes to the farming of Kernza, are there those that have tried out both irrigated and dry farming? Is Kernza a good candidate for dry farming? I guess is kind of the simplest way to ask that.
It's a great candidate for dry farming in eastern Wyoming, that's for sure, because it's a very resilient crop and it's able to sort of mediate a lot of the uncertainty that you get in dryland farming. Out east in Minnesota, especially where a lot of this research, there's a lot of research being done by the University of Minnesota on Kernza, and it's grown. I think the largest amount of acreage is in Minnesota. There farmers are trying to compete with organic irrigated corn, right? Which is it's a completely different economy and it's a completely different set of incentives for farmers. So I can't really speak about it over there. But certainly in Wyoming, it's a very good candidate for a dryland crop. Anything, if you irrigate it, will grow more here. We're in a very water limited environment. My part of the study doesn't look at the irrigated Kernza. We have, actually, if you give me a sec to bring up some data, we planted a couple plots of Kernza at the Sarek Research Station, which is in Lingle, Wyoming. We let the Kernza grow under just precipitation, and then the other plot, I think we irrigated one crop to mean annual precipitation, and then the other crop we fully irrigated to what would be similar to a wet year around here, and it about doubled the grain yield. I'm sure that farmers who have water rights are, of course, going to be irrigating their crops anyway. But this project is mainly focused on dryland farming because that is what the majority of farmers in this part of Wyoming do.
So along with that, with working with some of these farmers, what has been kind of the collaboration like on this project? I mean, you've mentioned you've been working with local farmers. Are you working with government agencies as well? Are you working with private sector at all?
Yeah, so this project was primarily funded by a Western SARE professional producer grant. So the idea behind that program is that they will fund research projects that work directly with farmers to help try out new agricultural techniques in a way that can directly benefit farmers in that area. So we worked with 5 farms in eastern Wyoming as a core part of the project. to see how their different management practices might work in terms of influencing soil health and water usage in farms in eastern Wyoming. I've been focusing primarily on one farm, but sort of looking at sort of the driest of the farms that we're studying. But other parts of our project involve a huge amount of coordination and outreach with farmers in the local area and even the broader area in like eastern Wyoming and eastern Colorado. Last spring, for example, we had a big field day that we hosted on one of our collaborating farmers' fields, Homestead Acres in Albin, Wyoming, where, for example, they're super interested in planting Kernza in and intercropping it with alfalfa and trying to incorporate that into the forage that they're producing in a way that's very cheap to produce and can sort of help build up their soil health for the long term. Right. So that's an example of a farmer who we're working with who's really interested in sort of starting up his business more, in maintaining his farm in a way where he can keep it productive for decades and generations to come. Whereas other farmers that we're working with are, for example, one of the farmers we're working with recently retired. And so he's looking for a crop that can help him sort of transition his farming into something that is slightly more sustainable and in a way where he can sort of go into semi-retirement and maintain sort of the health and productivity of the lands that he's working on. So we've been able to engage with local farmers in a huge number of ways. They're all interested in sort of learning about their different economic incentives and their different sets of values, both like economically and socially, in terms of what sort of growing grain and wheat in eastern Wyoming sort of means for them, and seeing how Kernza can help with that part of the local economy.
Awesome. So we've been talking for a while, kind of the general overview and some of the cool stuff with this project. I kind of wanted to get into the nitty gritty of it. And what are some of your primary hypotheses that you're testing with this project?
So my primary hypotheses that I'm looking at have to do with how Kernza can differentiate itself from annual wheat through mechanisms that I outlined earlier that have to do with, Kernza is a perennial. So it's there in the soil more of the time, and it can extract extra soil water that might evaporate out during the fallow months. It has a deep and more extensive root system that can let it access more soil moisture that is typically not accessible by annual wheat. And it could be more tolerant of water stress. So at the leaf level, or having to do with greater water access, letting it moderate its leaf level water stress through access to moisture in its roots. And our hypothesis is that those three mechanisms will influence Kernza's ability to better manage fluctuations in water availability and be able to produce more consistent yields. And the other part of our project is looking at soil health and Kernza's ability to maintain and improve soil health when you're transitioning from wheat into Kernza. So, we think that planting Kernza in what was previously a wheat field should change the soil microbiome to be more similar to what you might expect to see in a CRP field, so that conservation reserve program land that's specifically designed just to mimic the behavior of the native prairie without any effort to extract resources from it, basically. We're hoping to see, and we have seen, that planting Kernza does move the soil microbiome to be much more similar to that of CRP land, which is a strong indicator of improving soil health and the ability of the soil to sequester more carbon into the future. Those are the two primary scientific hypotheses that we're looking at.
Got it. And along with that, so what are some of the ways that you're going about this? How are you testing these hypotheses? What are you measuring? How are you going about measuring that? You want to kind of delve into all that fun stuff.
Yeah, so I guess this is for the meter podcast. So I should have mentioned before that we are using a bunch of meter soil moisture probes. We're using the Terrace 11 that we were able to get through the Grant A. Harris Fellowship. So that is funding a large part of this project as well. So one of the ways that we're looking at Kernza's water usage is through monitoring soil moisture over time. So we have soil moisture sensors installed in wheat, Kernza, and CRP fields at one of the farms that we're looking at in eastern Wyoming. And we're trying to see how soil moisture is sort of related to depth and treatment. So the treatment being CRP, Kernza, or wheat in these different fields. See if we are extracting more soil moisture from each of these fields. And we're also trying to associate those soil moisture values that we're seeing with indicators of plant stress, such as leaf water potential and leaf level fluorescence measurements, which are leaf level fluorescence measurements are physiological indicators of how much stress the actual photosynthetic machinery is under, whereas leaf water potential measurements are indicative of the physical state of water that's in the plant leaves. So at the end of the day, in the afternoon, you would expect to see really high leaf water potential values. And what we hope to see is that in Kernza, for example, there's lower indicators of water stress at the leaf level compared to wheat, even when soil moisture might be low, for example. Does that make sense? Right. So if soil moisture is low in wheat and in Kernza fields, the wheat might be having a much harder time than the Kernza is, because even though soil moisture is low, we might be able to access a much larger volume of soil and still extract moisture and photosynthesize and produce biomass and yield. So that is one of the key sets of measurements that we're looking at. We also looked at a lot of indicators of soil microbial health, which I know very little about. I'm a hydrologist, not a soil microbiologist. They looked at things like, soil microbial community composition and different indicators for the ratio of fungi to bacteria, carbon and nitrogen content, the presence of different enzymes that are representative of different microbial communities that might, for example, break down cellulose or cycle carbon very quickly or cycle carbon more slowly. That those are some of the things that the soil microbial side of things are looking at. Something else that I'm looking at is also trying to use modeling to try to sort of explain those differences in soil moisture that we're seeing. That's kind of part of testing my general hypothesis that the perenniality and rooting structure of Kernza is what is directly influencing its ability to extract moisture from the soil. So we can apply a well-tested process-based model that has been established to accurately represent hydrologic processes in different crops. Can we use that to show that for example, soil moisture dynamics and water potential dynamics that we're seeing in Kernza, if those are directly affected by rooting structure? That's sort of the final piece of the puzzle, right? We can observe all the changes in soil moisture and water potential that we want, but we need a way to actually mechanistically link it to the rooting structure of soil and how it actually tries to acquire water and grow.
Right. So as you've been going through this project, so what have been some of the, I guess, biggest challenges or difficulties that you've had in either working with or studying Kernza or measuring or modeling the data?
Yeah, well, a big problem is that we're doing a lot of this stuff on working farms. It's really hard to control the conditions that you're growing under because everybody has different preferences for how they manage their crops. So, the first year, one of the farmers that we were working with dropped out because a hailstorm destroyed his crop, and I'm done. I'm not growing this stuff anymore. I'll just put barley down instead. Just stuff like that, right? Having to work with the actual management practices that are in place, right? It's a lot harder to do a controlled experiment in these conditions. So, for example, the farm that I'm working on, we had to move some of our sensors from one field to another because the farmer changed his mind about what he wanted to grow there that year. He's like, yeah, I'm going to plant this to see, I'm going to put like a CRP seed mix in this field that is right now wheat. Like, oh, well, I kind of want another year of data, so I have to go and look in one of your other fields. Yeah, so that's definitely been a big challenge, but it's also meant that we can sort of observe these systems in the way that they actually exist out in the world. We have some crops, some plots at the Research Extension Center in Lingle, the CEREC, but they're quite small, and it's much wetter over there, and so it's not super representative of what most farmers in the area are dealing with. So it's had its deal of frustrations, but it's also been a great opportunity to work in the actual working environments that people are trying to grow the grain in.
So what have been some of your, I guess, key preliminary findings so far? Has there been anything that has surprised you with this research or what you've found so far, your insights?
What I've noticed so far is the soil moisture dynamics are definitely very different between Kernza and wheat. So we see that soil moisture is typically lower in the Kernza field at the rooting depths that we're interested in. So sort of between 0 and 15 centimeters into the ground. Soil moisture is a lot lower in Kernza. And whether or not that has to do with the rooting structure and Kernza extracting more moisture, or maybe the fact that Kernza is planted at a lower density, and so maybe there's more radiation and wind that can reach the ground and influence evaporation, is yet to be seen. But we do have some evidence that it does have to do with Kernza's rooting physiology, which is pretty exciting. So when we look at our water potential measurements, our leaf water potential measurements, we're seeing that while the water potential of wheat sort of swings wildly between extreme values, and we can see wheat drying out pretty quickly even before it begins to senesce, the leaf water potentials that we're observing in Kernza and in the CRP land are much more stable. So we're just not seeing the same indicators of water stress in Kernza and the CRP grasses that we're seeing in the annual wheat, which is really nice evidence to support the idea that Kernza might actually be getting more soil moisture than the wheat crops. That's sort of the most exciting thing that I've seen so far, because that seems like pretty strong support for our hypothesis. We'll have to see what the outcomes are when we try to model that behavior and see if we can sort of reproduce those findings and tie it back to rooting structure. But so far, we're on a pretty good track. Another exciting thing we've seen is that the rhizosphere microbiome. So the rhizosphere is that soil that's within like a millimeter or so of the roots of a plant, and it's sort of the interface between the soil and the plant, right? It's sort of where all the magic happens in the microbiome. After a couple of years of growing Kernza, the soil microbiome in Kernza is actually much more similar to that of what we see in the CRP land than it is to wheat. So there's a very strong change in the soil microbiome towards sort of our positive control, which is the CRP land, which we're using as a proxy for healthy soil that can, cycle carbon in a healthy way and hold on to nutrients and not erode, basically. That's another very exciting finding that we've seen. Yeah, and also, finally, our economic analysis has shown that Kernza does have the ability to be profitable in eastern Wyoming, which will make it much more appealing to farmers interested in transitioning their management strategies to make their operations more sustainable.
So if you were to put on your, say, crop consultant hat, what would you be saying to farmers who might be looking into growing Kernza and maybe either transitioning or finding some way to kind of mix with what they're doing already? How would you, I guess, maybe sell them on the costs and benefits and the potential impacts?
Well, it's a grain crop, but it's not wheat, right? You can't grow it like wheat and you can't treat it like wheat. It does definitely require a change in sort of a paradigm shift in how you might farm here. And, talking about the sort of downsides first, it does have a much lower yield. It is harder to get to market because some of the infrastructure for processing Kernza just is not here yet, but we're working on it and it's getting better every year. On the other hand, it's much cheaper to grow. If you grow it properly, it could help sustain your farming operations for many years to come. It will make you less at the mercy of the climate and Mother Nature, right? It should be able to weather those sort of dry spells and extreme weather events much better than an annual crop like wheat. I mean, it tastes pretty good too. I don't know. I'm a scientist, not a crop consultant, but I always feel a little weird when I'm supposed to give recommendations. I'm like, well, the study's still going on. We still have hypotheses we have to test. Uh, but yeah, from what we've seen so far, Kernza has a lower yield. It is a little bit harder to market right now, but it can really help mediate a lot of the frustrations that farmers in this part of the country experience in terms of unpredictability of their yield and how much money they have to pour in to growing a crop that might not even be useful at the end of the year. It's fantastic for marginal lands like
Right.
this.
You're working there in Wyoming in a harsher environment. Where are some other locations, whether in the U.S. or outside, that might be good candidates for potentially either expanding research into those regions or having farmers maybe try to implement some of these practices?
Kernza is really, is really directed at farmers in the Western US, but anywhere that is growing grain on marginal lands that can be very susceptible to drought, that might not have great resources for irrigation, or where putting heavy inputs into your farmland, such as like heavy tilling and having to plant year after year, or in places where farmers have been historically exploited economically by agricultural companies, could be excellent applications for this crop. Anywhere with a dryland grain farming where farmers struggle to produce consistent yields, and where farmers struggle with degrading soil health and having to pour more and more inputs like artificial fertilizer and things like that onto their crops. It could help. It could help. It won't fix everything. Like what we're doing here is just growing Kernza in like a monoculture, right? That's really not the intended purpose of the crop, right? The ideal is that you grow it in a sort of like a polyculture with, for example, intercropping with alfalfa or other plants that can help you more efficiently get nitrogen inputs and cycle nutrients and invite pollinators, those sorts of things, right? So this is really the baseline, right? Is what we're doing here, but it's anywhere that has a climate and economy similar to Eastern Wyoming will probably be a little bit better.
So you'd also mentioned, I mean, here and there in passing as well, some of the benefits with Kernza when it comes to the soil health. So you talked about how after growing Kernza for a while, that soil then is very similar in characteristics to kind of the native soil of the prairie there. Are there any other contributions that Kernza or similar perennial wheatgrasses might have to the environment in general and the ecosystem?
Well, this is where we start to get kind of outside of my
That's all right.
wheelhouse a little bit more. It's definitely been established that growing perennials like Kernza will stabilize soils. They can help improve a lot of soil characteristics if you grow them for long enough, right? The study that we're doing here is not long enough to see large scale changes in bulk soil characteristics. So, things like increases in more stable soil carbon pools, that's not something that we would be able to see in this study in this amount of time. But it's something that, perennial crops such as Kernza definitely do. And that comes with its own host of benefits, right? Like reducing erosion, improving your soil's capacity to hold water and allow water to infiltrate. Yeah, I'm not a soil health, I'm not a soil scientist. I'm not a soil scientist, but I know that, for example, in improving the aggregation of your soil and increasing soil organic matter is great for crops in a lot of ways, not just in how they use water.
Going back to kind of the collaboration side of things, how are you going about, I guess, just sharing your research and findings with kind of the broader agricultural community? I mean, this is something that we've talked about with many of our guests is, how do you discuss and disseminate your findings? I mean, it's one thing to do it at the academic level, you have papers and conferences and things like that. But especially when you're working with more so in the private sector or working with government agencies, I guess, have you had successes or difficulties in that outreach and education effort that you might be playing in trying to share your findings and your research?
Well, we found that farmers in this area are very interested in trying to improve their management practices, and really, they just really like tinkering with different aspects of their operations and trying to improve what they can with changing how they grow crops and what crops they grow. And all the farmers that we've worked with have been very excited to work with University of Wyoming Extension and just to try to improve what they're doing. So we have interacted a lot with farmers on various field days we've hosted, where we sort of send out calls through University of Wyoming Extension channels to try to invite farmers from the region to come and look at sort of what we've been researching and what the farmers we're working with, what their experiences have been growing these crops, trying to work with vendors, for example, who might be interested in using Kernza as a grain and trying to connect them directly with farmers in this area. We have done a lot of sort of local outreach, working with local news outlets and radio channels that are in like eastern Wyoming and western Nebraska to try to sort of get the word out. Yeah, so we've aside from academic stuff, we have done a lot of work directly with the farmers and trying to introduce them to the community of growers that we have found or have introduced to this crop so far in the last 4 years. And it's been going really well. We've gotten a lot of interest from farmers, especially in eastern Colorado and eastern Wyoming, who have heard about our project and have contacted us directly, and we've been able to put them in contact with the other farmers who are growing them, tell them about our findings, talk about the different channels that they can use to start growing the crop and where they can sell it and what we found in terms of management practices and all those sorts of things.
So what are your, I guess, next steps with your research here, or what do you see as the near and or long-term vision for this kind of research?
I think the long-term vision for this kind of research is to hopefully transition eastern Wyoming dryland agriculture away from annual crops entirely. That's really what this landscape needs from what we've seen, helping people transition into more sustainable agricultural systems. I think in the near term, a lot more research needs to be done in what are actually the best management practices for this crop in this area, right? This has been a relatively small study over a relatively short amount of time. And to really know what the benefits are here, we need to actually look at how management recommendations here differ from what they are in wetter ecosystems, such as, in central Kansas, for example. How you can plant Kernza, how you can manage it, how you can intercrop it with other species that might help improve your soil health and nutrient cycling. Yeah, and generally a much more in-depth economic analysis of growing Kernza here. Right now we have a economic analysis we've done is not entirely in depth, but it's enough to show that it's viable. But people want to know what are the actual risks associated with growing a new crop like this here. What are the actual, more precisely, what are the benefits that they could be getting? We're definitely on track for that. There are several people at the USDA ARS in Fort Collins who have started looking at Kernza, both in terms of doing basic research into ecophysiology of growing Kernza, or the plant physiology of growing Kernza here, but also in terms of how to introduce perennial crops and other sustainable farming practices to farmers in this area outside of just basic scientific research. So I think we're on a pretty good track to that.
Are there any new or emerging, I guess, technologies or methods that you'd love to be able to incorporate into your research? Or at the same time, I guess, flip side of that coin, as you've been working and going about your research, you'd be like, man, I really wish I had a tool or something that could do this, or something that could measure that, or things like that.
I think I regret not taking better soil water potential data. Having high quality soil water potential data is something that is difficult to get in the field. It's something that I definitely wish that I had. That's sort of the main thing that I think about. One thing that we tried to do that didn't work out, not because the technology didn't work, but just because the conditions weren't right for it, was we tried to get some eddy flux data on the different fields that we were looking at, but the geometry of the fields was such that the fields were too narrow and you couldn't actually, the footprint of the different towers that we were using were far too large for that to actually be useful. So that's an entirely different problem. But I think if I did the project again, I would focus a lot more on the below ground. I did a lot of work looking at leaf level physiology of Kernza here compared to wheat. Didn't really see much that was particularly enlightening, and all the interesting things seem to be happening below ground.
I think, yeah, that's something that, going back to what you were talking about with the water potential side of things, is that's something that we always try to help our customers understand how important it can be to have both your water content and water potential, and figure out, what is your water release curve for your particular soils, and other things like that, and just how does the soil move and how is it held within the soils, and availability to the plants there, all that fun stuff. Well, I think we're up with our time here. Any other final thoughts or anything else that you'd like our audience to know?
Well, if you want to learn more about our project, we do have a website that is pretty up to date, as well as an Instagram page where you can learn a lot more about growing Kernza in Wyoming and sort of what the goals of the project are and what our findings have been. It's just kernzawyoming.org, and that's the same as the Instagram that we have as well. There's lots of resources, both for farmers and other researchers who might be interested. That's a great way to get in contact.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you very much, Alex, for joining us today. We do really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us and discuss your cool projects on researching Kernza and other things.
Yeah, I appreciate being invited here.
And if you in the audience have any questions about this topic or want to hear more, feel free to contact us at metergroup.com or reach out to us on Twitter at meter_ENV. And you can also view the full transcript from today in the podcast description. That's all for now. Stay safe, and we'll catch you next time on We Measure the World.